This is not the story of how the Mencho fell. It is the story of why Harfuch was the only one who could do it. And the difference between those two stories is everything. 400 impacts against his truck, grenades, 2 escorts lifeless. Harfuch survived and discovered something about the Mencho that no one else had discovered in decades of searching for him. It was not military intelligence. It was not an informant. When I tell you, you will not be able to believe that the answer was there for so long. There are images that stay etched, not because you have seen them with your own eyes, but because someone described them to you in a certain way, with a certain tone, with a certain pause before finishing the sentence, and they already stayed there. In some place in the head where things do not go away. The 26th of June of 2020 was one of those days, not for everyone. Of course, for most people it was just any Sunday, a Sunday of pandemic, of home, of bad news that no one knew how to process anymore. The streets of Mexico City were empty at that hour, or almost. The kind of emptiness that the pandemic had given to everything. That strange sensation that time had become slow and at the same time unpredictable. No one knew well what time it was, nor what day, nor how long they had been locked up. Everything had compressed into a single gray texture. But for some specific people, that day changed everything. The way they understood their work, the way they understood the risk, the way they slept or stopped doing so, the way they looked at the routes they took every morning, the way they thought about the people who worked next to them and who did not ask to be in the center of any story. And there is a man in particular for whom that Sunday was not just a difficult day. It was the beginning of something, although he still did not know it. Lomas de Chapultepec is one of those neighborhoods in Mexico City where everything seems controlled. The wide streets, the well-kept trees, the buildings that do not speak of what happens inside. It is one of those areas where one would expect nothing to happen, where people assume, for some reason difficult to explain, that chaos has geographical limits, that the things that happen in other places, in other neighborhoods, in other cities, do not arrive there. That is what the people who live in that type of places think, and sometimes they are right. And sometimes Sunday morning shows them that they are not. That morning, around 6:30, an armored truck was advancing through the intersection of Paseo de la Reforma with Monte Blanco. Inside was Omar García Harfuch, at that time Secretary of Citizen Security of Mexico City. He was going, as always, like any other day, the type of journey that one does so many times that one stops thinking about it, the type of routine that becomes automatic and precisely because of that can become a problem. What happened next did not last long. Those things never last long. But the time it lasted was enough for everything. A numerous command closed the convoy from different points. It was not something improvised. It was not something that someone decided at the moment, waking up that morning and thinking it would be a good day to try it. There was coordination. There were assigned positions. There was armament, which is not the type of thing that anyone gets from one day to the next. Weapons that one normally associates with other types of conflicts, with formal war zones, with recognized armies, with state budgets. More than 400 impacts on the truck, grenades, a level of operation that when the reporters began to arrive at the scene, many did not know exactly how to describe it, because there was no journalistic language in Mexico that was completely prepared to describe something like that in the middle of Sunday morning. In one of the most visible neighborhoods of the capital, García Harfuch survived. That is the first thing that must be said. And the most important, he survived because the vehicle was armored, and because the armor held what very few things hold. But surviving does not mean coming out with nothing. He came out with wounds in the arm, in the clavicle, in the knee, with shrapnel that the body does not expel alone, and that the doctors had to work with care, with patience, knowing that it is not the same a wound that is seen as a wound that is not seen, but that also hurts. 2 of his escorts did not have the same luck, and a woman who was simply passing by there, who was going where she was going without knowing anything about anything, without having the slightest idea that that Sunday at that corner, her path was going to cross with something that had nothing to do with her either. Those 3 people became the specific weight of that day. Not the convoy, not the operation, not the intelligence analyses that came later. Those 3 people, their names, their families, the way someone had to call by phone to give news that no one wants to give or receive, ever. That is the real weight of what happened that Sunday. The rest is politics and strategy and communiques and analyses, but the real weight is that. Now, there is something that happened in the minutes following the attack that is worth understanding, because it says a lot about what would come later, more than any formal analysis could say. García Harfuch, still with the wounds unattended, still in the midst of the chaos of what had just happened, took his phone and published a message. He did it himself from where he was, without waiting for anyone to write anything for him, without consulting with a communication team, without measuring the impact of his words in the way that modern officials are trained to measure everything they say. He said that the attack came from the Jalisco New Generation cartel. He said it with name. He said it clearly, without detours and without waiting for any investigation result. Many people noticed that and noticed it for different reasons. The media noticed it because it was news. A Secretary of Security publicly pointing to a specific organization from an active scene with wounds that had not yet been treated. It was the type of image that is not forgotten and that generates its own coverage cycle. But other people noticed it for another reason, because it is not what wounded officials normally do. It is not the protocol. It is not what someone does when the instinct should be to hold back, wait, consult, let the formal channels do their work. That message was a statement, but it was also something else. It was a signal of what was happening inside that man at that moment, of the type of clarity that sometimes arrives when things get extreme and there is no longer room for ambiguity. And if one thinks about it well, it was also the first moment of what 5 years later would culminate in something that no one, absolutely no one, expected to happen in that way. But to understand that, one has to go slower, because the stories that matter are not told running. They are told with the rhythm they deserve, with the silences they deserve, with the attention that each piece deserves before the next one appears. Before continuing, I need you to stay with an image, not a physical image, a mental image. Imagine someone who has just lived something that he did not expect to live, who is in the middle of something that did not end completely, that still has consequences moving, that still has people around responding to what happened, and who at that moment, instead of closing his eyes or waiting or letting others do what they have to do, makes a decision. Not an operational decision, not a tactical decision, a character decision. That moment matters much more than it seems, because the people who know García Harfuch from before that Sunday say that in that message was everything that needed to be known about how he was going to respond to the rest of this story. That it was like a signature, like a statement of intention that did not need more words because it had already said everything it needed to say. And what it said between the lines was this: I am going to remember this. The name Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes has been circulating for years in conversations that are not had out loud. It is one of those names that people know, but that few pronounce without certain caution, as if the name itself had a particular weight, as if saying it in the wrong place could have consequences that cannot be predicted exactly, but that one does not want to discover either. Known as the Mencho, he built over 2 decades a structure that analysts described with words that they normally reserve for armies, not for criminal organizations, for armies. With zones of control, with logistics, with firepower capacity that exceeded what many states could mobilize in response, with a geographical presence that covered entire states and that had crossed borders in ways that international agencies documented with growing concern. He was born in Michoacán, in a family that had access to nothing other than what fieldwork could offer. He spent time in the United States looking for something different, as millions of people who cross that border do, with the hope that the other side offers what the side here does not offer. He was detained in California in the 90s for heroin transportation. He was deported and returned, not with nothing, with something he had learned about how certain structures work, about how money moves, about how loyalty is built when money is not enough. And what he built upon his return was something that took decades to understand in its true dimension. Not because there were no signs. There were, but because the signs came in such a gradual, so constant way that it was difficult to see the whole while one was looking at the parts. The Jalisco New Generation cartel, the organization that he consolidated and led, did not follow the model of other similar structures. It did not stay in one state. It did not operate from the shadows, hoping that no one would bother it too much. It expanded actively. It confronted other organizations in ways that generated conflicts in multiple states at the same time. It attacked state forces in ways that in other contexts would have provoked completely different responses, but that in Mexico generated a debate that still does not have a clear answer about what is the correct way to respond to something like that. In 2015, they shot down a military helicopter in Jalisco. That is not something that happens normally in any country. It is not something that a criminal organization does, and that remains in the record as just another event. It is the type of thing that changes the conversation, that forces whoever has the responsibility to respond to completely recalibrate what they are looking at. In that same 2015, they blocked more than 50 points of the state in a single day. Trucks lit on highways, roads closed, a demonstration of territorial control that was, in essence, a message not to the press, not to public opinion, to the authorities, that said, "This is what we can do when we want." Think about that. Those things happened. They are documented. They are not interpretation. And yet, for years, the Mencho continued to be a figure that intelligence agencies tracked but did not find. A presence that was felt in every operation, in every communiqué, in every detention of people close to him, but that did not end up materializing in a cell, in an airport, in a court. There is something important here that is worth saying out loud, because many people assume that when a person has been searched for years and does not appear, the reason has to be one, that someone protects him, that there is institutional complicity, that the system fails by design. And sometimes that is true. The history of Mexico has enough examples for the suspicion to be understandable. But there is also another reason that the analysts who work on this mention much more frequently than it appears in the headlines. And it is simply that finding someone who does not want to be found, who has the resources not to be found, who has the discipline not to be found, is extraordinarily difficult, more than most people imagine when they think about it from outside. It is not a movie where the phone is tracked in 10 seconds. It is not a series where the brilliant detective connects the dots in 45 minutes. It is work that sometimes lasts years, and that sometimes after those years does not lead anywhere, because the missing piece has not appeared yet. The Mencho lasted so long without appearing in part because some people who should have did not do what they should have. That is true, and it must be said. But he also lasted so long because he was extraordinarily good at what he did. And those two things can be true at the same time. Stay with that, because now comes something that connects directly with the above, something that no one expected to happen in that way. By the time the attack against García Harfuch occurred in 2020, the Mencho had been the most wanted target in Mexico for years. The United States authorities offered a reward of $10 million for information leading to his capture. The Mexican authorities had him at the top of their lists. There were operations, there was intelligence, there were detentions of people close to him, family members, collaborators, people who had been in the right circle at the wrong time. But he did not appear. And then something happened that from outside seems contradictory, but that those who know that world say has a particular logic that is not so difficult to understand if one thinks about how power works when it does not have enough counterweight. Someone made the decision to attack the Secretary of Security of the largest city in the country, in the middle of the morning, in one of the most visible neighborhoods of the capital, with a deployment that could not go unnoticed and that was not designed to go unnoticed. Why? That is the question that still generates different answers depending on whom you ask. And it is a question worth asking seriously, not as rhetoric, because the answer says a lot about what happened later. Some say it was a message, a demonstration of power directed both inward to the organization and outward, a way of saying that there were no limits, that there was no sufficient protection, that there was no position high enough to be untouchable, a way to consolidate inward, to show those who were part of the structure that the power they had was real and not just declarative. Others point to something more specific. García Harfuch had a profile that was not that of a typical political official. He had worked in the Criminal Investigation Agency. He knew intelligence methodologies that are not those learned by security secretaries who arrive at the position from politics. He knew how cases are built. He knew how people, events, resources are connected. He knew how to work with information that is not publicly available. Perhaps the attack was not just a general message. Perhaps it was something much more directed. The elimination of someone who represented a specific threat, not just a position. But what no one, not even the most informed analysts, could foresee was the real consequence of that attack. Because in intelligence, there is a principle that is not exclusive to intelligence, that anyone who has tried to intimidate someone knows intuitively, although they have not studied it. When you attack someone and fail, the result can be exactly the opposite of what you were looking for. You can turn a person who was already looking for you into a person who looks for you with a completely different energy. Because when one makes the decision to attack someone and fails, something changes. Not necessarily immediately, not with trumpets or declarations of war. It changes in a more silent way, more patient, deeper. The type that does not make noise while it happens, but that produces results that do make noise when they arrive. And that is precisely what no one saw coming. There is something that I have not told you yet about what happened that Sunday, something that the official reports mention, but that the headlines do not always highlight, because there are too many elements competing for space. Something that, when one puts it in context with what happened 5 years later, acquires a completely different weight from the one it had that day. But let's go by parts, because if I tell you now, it loses the strength it has when it arrives at the right moment. Stories have their own rhythm, not the one you want, the one they have. What I can tell you is this. That day, while García Harfuch was being attended, while the experts did their work at the scene, while the media began to assemble their coverages and social networks processed what had just happened, someone within the country's security structures was taking notes, not literally perhaps, but in that other way in which people take note of the things that matter, the way that does not require paper or pen, the way that stays in the head and does not get lost even if time passes. And those notes over time became something. The months that followed the attack of June of 2020 were strange months for everyone, but especially for those who had the responsibility to respond to what had happened. There was pandemic. There was economic crisis. There was an amount of informational noise that made it difficult to follow anything with the depth it deserved. The news arrived in avalanche and disappeared with the same speed. Collective attention was an exhausted resource, and in that context, what had happened in Lomas de Chapultepec ran the risk of becoming just another event in an endless list of difficult events. But in parallel to all that, something was moving. Not in the news, not in the press conferences, not in the official communiques. It was moving at another level. Some people close to the case, people who speak with great care when they speak, describe that period as one of silent construction, as if the attack had activated something that before was in a different state, not off, but in a different mode, as if the intelligence that already existed, the processes that were already in motion, had begun to move with a different energy. García Harfuch recovered, returned to his functions, did not speak much about the subject publicly, beyond what he said in the first days, and that was also noted by those who pay attention to that type of things. The silence of someone who had more than enough reasons not to shut up, who had the moral legitimacy and the public platform to speak as much as he wanted, and who chose not to do so. Some interpreted it as political caution, as a strategic decision not to give more information than necessary and not to show the cards before time. Others simply said that he was the type of person who does not need to speak much for what he is thinking to be clear, that there are people who express themselves with their actions in a way that makes words almost redundant. Both things can be true at the same time. Detentions related to the attack of that Sunday arrived over time, not all at once, not with the spectacle that one would expect given the weight of the event. They arrived in the way these things arrive when the process is serious, gradually, with the solidity that time worked gives, with the type of results that hold up in court and not just in a communique. Vehicles secured, armament removed from circulation, thousands of cartridges, people linked to the operation of the 26th of June who faced legal consequences in ways that were documented and confirmed. Each of those detentions was a thread, and the threads, when worked with method, can lead to other things, to other threads, to other nodes, to a fabric that eventually begins to show its complete structure. But that process is not linear. It does not have the clean narrative of a procedure that advances point by point towards a predictable destination. It has setbacks. It has moments where the information that was had turns out to be incomplete, or where what was believed to be known was not exactly what it was. It has frustration. It has the type of patience that is not passivity, but something completely different. The active decision not to rush when rushing could spoil what is being built. Here I am going to ask you something. Keep in your head everything I have told you so far. The wounds of that Sunday, the 3 who did not arrive home, the message from the phone, the threads that were pulled. Because when you get to the part that is missing, all those pieces are going to find their place, and you are going to understand why it was important to tell them in this order. Still missing, but less is missing. In 2024, the political map of Mexico changed. Claudia Sheinbaum won the presidency in an election whose results changed the composition of power in the country in ways that are still being processed. And with that change came another. Omar García Harfuch was named Secretary of Security and Citizen Protection of Mexico. Plain of the city, of the country. The scale changed. The resources changed. The institutional authority changed. The access to information that before required interagency coordination was now directly part of his jurisdiction. And something else changed too, although this is more difficult to document and easier to understand. If one pays attention to how people move when they have access to instruments that they did not have before, when the perimeter of what is possible expands significantly. Some people use that space to do exactly what they were already doing, only more. And some people use that space to do something that was not possible to do before. There are those who say that from the moment Harfuch arrived at that secretariat, the focus on certain objectives acquired a different precision, that the lines of work that had existed for years, that had operated in parallel without fully converging, began to organize in a way that had not been possible before due to coordination issues, access, formal authority over the processes. It is not something that someone declares publicly. It is not the type of thing that appears in a press bulletin or in a Wednesday press conference, but there are people who lived it from inside, and when asked, some nod their head in a particular way, the type of nod that says more than any phrase could say. There is a name that has not yet appeared in this story and that needs to appear now, because without it, what comes next is not fully understood. Rubén Oseguera González, known as the Menchito, son of Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, was detained in 2023 in Mexico and subsequently extradited to the United States. His case was one of those events that the headlines covered for a day or two and that then remained in the collective memory without the weight that perhaps they deserved. But there are people who studied that detention with great care and who point out something that is not evident at first sight. The extradition of the Menchito was not just the extradition of a person accused of specific crimes. It was also, in terms of what it implies for a structure like the one his father had built, a signal that the mechanisms that before could offer certain protection no longer offered the same protection. And there is another element, one more difficult to prove with documents, but that those who know how these structures operate mention with consistency. When a father who has spent decades making calculated, cold, strategic decisions loses his son to the system that he has been avoiding all his life, something changes in the way he processes things, not necessarily dramatically, not in a way that is visible from outside, but it changes. The emotional state affects judgment, affects who is allowed to approach and who is kept away. It affects risk tolerance, affects small decisions that in another state would have been different. No one can prove that this had a direct and documentable effect on what occurred on the 22nd of February of 2026, but neither can it be discarded, and in the history of 5 years that connects that Sunday in June with that Monday in February, it is an element that deserves to be present. Now I need you to pay attention to what comes, because there is something that most people do not know about the months prior to the 22nd of February of 2026, something that, when I start to tell you, is going to change the way you understand not only that day, but the whole process that led there. But before that, I need you to understand something about the Mencho as a person. Not just as a name in a file or as a figure in a narrative. There is very little verified material about him. Few photos, and those that exist are from years ago. No interview, no video that anyone can confirm with certainty is almost an anomaly in the information age, where almost everything leaves a trace, where almost everything eventually appears somewhere, where the total absence of digital footprint has become practically impossible for most people. He was not most people. What is known, and that different sources repeat with sufficient consistency to consider it reliable, is that he had serious health problems for years. Renal conditions that required treatment, the type of condition that complicates constant movement, that requires specific equipment, that requires trusted medical personnel, that requires access to supplies that are not easy to get discreetly, and that leave traces that other things do not leave. Medical supplies have supply chains, they have providers, they have delivery routes, they have people who move them from one place to another. and all those things can, in certain conditions, with the right information and the right method, become information. Some analysts pointed that out for years as a potential point of vulnerability in the way he could move. Not publicly, because making that public would have been precisely the opposite of useful. But in reserved conversations, in analyses that do not circulate freely, that variable was present. Health as a trace, medical need as a thread to pull. And now I need you to remember that because it is going to come back sooner than you think. 2025 was a year of work that very little of it became visible in real time. That does not mean that nothing happened. Things happened that the official communiques recorded. Detentions of people identified as part of CJ structures in different states. Securing of assets, of vehicles, of armament. Legal processes that advanced at their own rhythm, which is always slower than anyone would want. But there was something else running in parallel to all that. Something that did not appear in any communique, and that those who were not inside the process had no way of seeing. An intelligence work that, according to sources that speak with the caution corresponding to those who know that words have weight, had been building for much longer than any headline could suggest. A work that involved coordination between different agencies, different levels of the security apparatus, different sources of information that normally are not shared fluidly between them, because institutions have their own rhythms, their own priorities, their own operating logics. That process had had errors. It was not linear nor clean. There were moments where something that seemed like a clue turned out not to be. There were moments where the available information was sufficient to generate a hypothesis, but not to act on it with the certainty that an operation of that nature requires. There was patience that had to be active, not passive. The difference between the two types of patience is that the active one hurts more. But it had advanced, and at some point in that year, something changed in that process. Something aligned in a way that had not been aligned before. It was not a unique and dramatic moment, or at least it was not from outside. It was more like when an image that one has been looking at for a long time suddenly appears with a focus that it did not have before. The people who were there describe that moment in different ways. Some speak of a specific piece of information that changed the panorama. Others say it was the accumulation of many small pieces that suddenly formed a coherent image that did not exist before. Others, with more economy of words, simply say that the moment arrived. What none of them describe in detail is what exactly that piece was, or what exactly was seen when those pieces came together, and that reserve is not accidental. There are reasons why that information is handled with care, and those reasons have nothing to do with the past, but with what still continues. The 21st of February of 2026 was Saturday. In Jalisco, as in many states of the country, life followed its usual rhythm. There was nothing in the news of the day that suggested what was going to happen less than 24 hours later. There were no leaks. There were no rumors that had reached the media. There was nothing visible from outside that could be anticipated. But inside certain structures, inside certain work groups that had been in a state of concentration for months, that has no precise name in ordinary language, the atmosphere was different. There are people who were in those previous conversations who describe a mixture of tension and clarity that is difficult to transmit to those who have not lived it. It is not euphoria, because euphoria clouds judgment, and what was needed at that moment was exactly the opposite of clouded judgment. It is not fear, exactly, although fear was also present, because it would be absurd to say that it was not. It is something more similar to concentration that sometimes arrives when one has been chasing something for a long time, and suddenly the path is in front of one, and what remains is simply to travel it. Not that the task is easy, it is that one already knows what has to be done. The details of the operation are not public in their entirety. That is something that must be said with honesty, because pretending otherwise would be to build a narrative on information that is not available. There are elements that the authorities have confirmed. There are elements that the media have been able to reconstruct through sources and official documentation that was gradually made public. And there are elements that are still in that space where the official version and the unofficial information do not fully coincide. What is documented and confirmed is that the operation was authorized from the Secretariat of Security and Citizen Protection, under the command of García Harfuch, that it involved military and intelligence forces working in a coordinated manner that was executed in the territory of the state of Jalisco, and that it had as its objective the location of Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes. The 22nd of February of 2026, very early in the morning, something occurred in Jalisco that in the first hours the media did not fully understand. There was fragmented information arriving from different sources. There were versions that did not fully coincide with each other. There were sources that confirmed and sources that doubted. There was the type of informational chaos that normally surrounds large events before the image clears, and before someone with authority to say what happened says it officially. But gradually, over those first hours, something began to take shape. The image that had been fragmented began to have more defined contours. And then came the confirmation that no one in many, many years had expected to receive in this way. Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, the Mencho, had been located. The operation had concluded, and he was not going to be able to move from there. Here one has to stop for a moment, not because the story has ended, but because there is something at this point that requires to be said with care. Because if it is not said well, something important is lost. The fall of a figure like that is not a simple moment. It is not an event that has a single meaning and that can be processed in a single way. It is many things at the same time, and not all of them are easy to articulate. For the authorities who had been working on that objective for years, who had put time, resources, energy, and in some cases, parts of their own personal life in that work, it was something that can hardly be described with ordinary words, not because it is inexpressible, but because the available words seem insufficient for the scale of what it represented, for the communities that had lived under the presence and influence of that organization in different states of the country. The meaning was completely different, more complex, more loaded with personal history than with strategic analysis, more immediate and more concrete than any institutional evaluation. And for the security apparatus of the Mexican state, as an institution, it was a moment that speaks of a capacity that many inside and outside the country had questioned for years, that they had said in academic forums and in hallway conversations that it did not exist, or that it could not exist given the state of the institutions and given the level of complexity of the problem they faced. The 22nd of February said something about that. Not everything that had to be said, but something important. Now, yes, now comes what you were waiting for from the beginning. When the teams that participated in the operation began to document the scene in Jalisco, one of the first things that caught attention was something that does not have to do directly with the person they were looking for. It has to do with what was around. The medical infrastructure that was found in the place was of a specificity that is not casual nor improvised. Equipment supplies, clear and documentable evidence that someone with a serious medical condition had been receiving attention in that place for a considerable time, not a couple of days. Time. Do you remember what I told you before about the Mencho's health problems? About the renal conditions? About how analysts had identified that for years as a variable that could have implications for intelligence on his movements? That variable was, according to sources that speak with the appropriate caution, one of the central pieces of the process that led to the operation of the 22nd of February. Not the only piece, not the only variable, but one that turned out to be fundamental in the construction of the image that eventually allowed to act. The trace that medical need leaves, the people who have to move to get and provide specialized attention, the supplies that have to be acquired through some chain, the routes that are repeated because they cannot be avoided when the need is constant and the condition does not give truce. For years, that had been difficult to turn into actionable information. There were too many variables, too much noise, too many unconfirmed possibilities. The work of separating the relevant from what is not in that context is in itself an enormous work that requires time and method. But at some point in the months prior to the operation, those pieces began to articulate in a different way. They began to form something that had not had form before. And when they had form, the path to Jalisco became clearer than it had ever been. There is something else that they found that day that is still being processed and analyzed with care. Documents. I am not going to describe their content in detail because that content is not publicly available in its entirety, and speculating on what is not known would be exactly the opposite of what this story deserves. But what sources close to the process have been able to confirm is that what was found in that place included material that provided information on the operational structure of the organization, on names, on roles, on the way certain decisions were made and communicated inside that vertical structure that had been for outsiders almost completely opaque for so long. The type of material that, in the best case, could have implications that go much further than what happened on the 22nd of February of 2026. The type of material that makes some analysts say, with the caution of those who know that premature statements have consequences, that what happened that day was not the end point of anything, that it was, in a certain way, the starting point of something else, a different thing, with different tools, but that shares the same method that was used to get there. The reaction inside the organization in the days that followed was exactly what the analysts who understood its structure had predicted it would be. Although predicting it in abstract and seeing it happen in real time are different in terms of what they imply. Uncertainty, not immediate and visible chaos. Not dramatic collapse that the media could photograph, but that type of disorientation that occurs when a deeply centralized structure loses its center suddenly. And the people who remained do not know exactly what that means for them, nor what they are supposed to do from that moment, nor in whom they should trust now that the axis around which everything revolved is no longer there. The internal communications, according to what has been able to be reconstructed through different sources, showed signs of that disorientation. Not everyone responded in the same way. Some moved things quickly, the type of movement that reveals more than it hides when someone is paying attention. Others kept silent. Others sought to consolidate something, although what they wanted to consolidate was not entirely clear, not even for themselves. And the agencies that monitor that type of communications, that have been doing it for years with methods that have become increasingly sophisticated, were paying attention. For García Harfuch, the 22nd of February was not the end of a job. It was the confirmation that the job had been worth it, but also the demarcation of a new stage with its own challenges and its own complexities. Because if there is something that any person with real experience in these structures knows, it is that an organization of that size and that age does not disappear with the fall of its leader. It reorganizes, although not in the same way. It adapts, although not with the same efficiency. Sometimes it fractures into smaller parts that are, in certain senses, more difficult to track precisely because they are smaller and because fragmentation can create new dynamics that did not exist before. What does change is the scale, the capacity, the operational coherence, the capacity to coordinate at the national level, the credibility that accumulates over time and that makes an organization able to recruit, able to maintain loyalties, able to move with the authority that only history gives. All that is significantly affected when the center of such a vertical structure disappears, and those effects are not instantaneous. They develop over time in ways that sometimes are not predictable, but the general direction of those effects is predictable. And it is the reason why the 22nd of February matters beyond what happened that day. The official communiqué that confirmed what happened was careful in its language. There was no triumphalism. There were no declarations of definitive victory, nor of problem solved. There was a sober description of the facts and a confirmation of the identity of the individual who had been located in the operation. That was also noted at a time when social networks and the media asked for emotional reactions, when any person with access to a camera had something to say. The official response was measured, almost austere, in comparison with what the result could have justified. Some people interpreted it as institutional caution, as the awareness that declaring total victory over such a complex organization would be premature, potentially counterproductive, and dishonest with the reality of what still remained to be done. Other people interpreted it in another way, as the signal that those who made those decisions knew with clarity what they had achieved, but also with equal clarity what was missing, and that there was an important difference between knowing that and declaring it. Both readings are possible, and both, to a certain extent, are probably correct at the same time. Let us return for a moment to García Harfuch, because there is something about that 22nd of February that I want to tell you, something that does not appear in any communiqué nor in any coverage, and that says perhaps more about who that man is than any official statement could say. Harfuch knew what had happened in Jalisco from very early that morning. He was connected to the operation in the way that corresponds to those who have the responsibility to authorize that type of actions and to answer for their results. And when the confirmation arrived, when there was no longer ambiguity about the result, the people who were close to him at that moment described something that is not exactly celebration. It was not simple relief. It was not euphoria. It was not the type of expression that one would expect from someone who has just completed something that had been trying for a long time. One of them, speaking with great care about that moment, used an image that is worth repeating because it is precise in a way that more elaborate descriptions are not always. He said that the expression on Harfuch's face at that moment reminded him of that of someone who has just let go of something very heavy that he had been carrying for a long time. Not the expression of someone who won, the expression of someone who can finally stop carrying something that weighed more than anyone could see from outside. He said no more than that, and it was not necessary. If you remember what I told you at the beginning of this story, if you remember that Sunday of June of 2020, if you remember the wounds in the arm and the clavicle and the knee, if you remember the message from the phone and the two escorts who did not return home, and the woman who was going where she was going, without knowing that that Sunday was going to be the last, then you understand, without anyone having to explain why that particular moment had that weight. 5 years and 8 months. That is what happened between that Sunday and that Monday of February. 5 years and 8 months of work that did not make noise while it happened, of silent construction, of active patience, of decisions that no one saw take and that nevertheless were there, one after the other, leading to the place where everything ended up arriving. There is something that the accounts about this type of events usually omit, and that, nevertheless, may be the most important of all. More important than the names, than the dates, than the operations, the human cost of the process, not the visible cost, the one that appears in the news and that generates coverage and analysis, but the other, the one that the people who do this type of work carry for years, those who build intelligence, knowing that the error can have consequences that go beyond the professional, those who coordinate operations in which the risk is real and present and not abstract, those who make difficult decisions, with incomplete information, as they are always taken in that type of work, knowing that if something goes wrong, the responsibility does not dilute, but concentrates. No one talks much about that cost, in part because those who have lived it usually do not have much interest in describing it publicly, in part because the account of these events tends to focus on the results and not on what it cost to get to them, in part because there is a tradition in certain type of work of not talking more than strictly necessary. But that cost exists and is part of the complete history of what happened between June of 2020 and February of 2026. García Harfuch carried something during those 5 years. He carried it in ways that probably no one can see completely from outside. Physical wounds heal. The others are more difficult to measure, and the result of the 22nd of February was not only the result of accumulated intelligence, of institutional coordination, of operations executed with the precision that time and method give. It was also the result of that which is not seen nor measured easily, of that weight that someone decides to carry and not let go until he can. The story of what happened between that Sunday of June of 2020 and that Monday of February of 2026 is, in many senses, the story of a decision sustained over time, not a decision taken in a unique moment, a decision that was taken again and again during 5 years in conditions that were not always favorable and that sometimes were actively difficult, a decision to continue building when the results were not visible and when the temptation to abandon or change the focus must have been considerable. A decision to believe that patient intelligence and sustained coordination could reach a place that quick reaction and spectacular deployment had not been able to reach. That is, perhaps the most important thing of this story, not as a moral, because morals simplify what is complex, but as an honest description of what happened and why it happened in this way and not in another. There are ways of building that do not generate headlines while they happen. There are works that are not seen until they produce a result that no one anticipated completely, although, in retrospect, everything seems inevitable. There are processes that seem slow, but that in reality are the opposite of slow. They are deep, and depth, in the end, produces results that speed alone cannot produce. What was built between 2020 and 2026 was that, and the 22nd of February was the moment when that depth became visible for everyone at the same time. In Jalisco, in the days that followed the operation, life continued, as it always continues, regardless of what has just happened in some place of its territory, with its routines, with its rhythms, with that mixture of relief and uncertainty that usually accompanies large events that change something, but do not change everything at once. The communities that had lived under the presence of that organization for years did not celebrate in a way that the media could easily photograph or turn into image of the day. The responses were more quiet, more private, more difficult to put in a frame, more loaded with personal history than with public reaction. Some people said they expected to see concrete changes in their daily life, that the result of the operation had to translate into something tangible, in the possibility of moving with more freedom, in the reduction of certain presences that for years had defined what was possible and what was not possible in their own neighborhood, in their own street, in their own business. Others were more cautious. They had seen before situations that seemed definitive changes and that then turned out to be transitions towards other forms of the same problem, or towards different problems that were not easy to live either. That caution is legitimate. It is the product of real experience and not of abstract cynicism. And it is also, in a certain way, the most honest measure of what this type of results mean and what they do not mean, what they can change, and what requires much more time and much more work to change. There is a question that does not have an easy answer yet, and that, nevertheless, it is necessary to ask. What does it really mean in concrete terms that an organization like the CJNG is hit in this way? The most serious analysts have different positions on this, and it is worth listening to them without choosing in advance which one is correct. Some argue that the impact, however significant, has important limits, that organizations of this nature that have survived operations, detentions of leaders, sustained pressure for years, have adaptation mechanisms that make no individual, however central, truly irreplaceable in the long term, that the problem is not in any person, but in the conditions that make possible that type of structures exist, and that those conditions do not change with an operation. Others argue that the specific case of the CJNG is different, precisely because of the nature of its structure, and because of the particular role that its leadership played in its construction and consolidation. That what the Mencho represented was not just a position that someone else could occupy, but a source of cohesion and authority that had been built over decades and that is not easily replicated. There is no way to know now which of those positions is going to turn out more correct. Time and the events that follow will say that in a way that no previous analysis can anticipate with certainty. But what can be said is that the 22nd of February of 2026 was something that had not happened before in that specific context, and that its consequences, whatever they may be, are just beginning to develop. There is something worth saying about what an operation of this nature means for the institutions that execute it. Beyond the concrete result, Mexico has a long and complicated history with its own security institutions. A history that includes moments of documented corruption, of complicities that reached the highest levels, of structures that were supposed to protect and that instead became part of the problem they were supposed to solve. That history exists, it is documented, and it is the context within which any operation of this type has to be understood if one wants to understand it truly and not just in abstract. That means that the 22nd of February of 2026 did not occur in a vacuum. It occurred in a country that had seen similar figures protected in some cases by the same institutions that said they were looking for them, that had seen intelligence processes contaminated by interests that had nothing to do with public security, that had seen promised results that did not arrive, or that arrived in a partial and temporary way. That also forms part of the weight of what occurred that Monday of February, not because it is possible to affirm with certainty that this time it was different in all aspects, but because the simple possibility that something like that occurred, that a serious and sustained intelligence process arrived where it arrived, is in itself a datum that cannot be ignored. The people who have been analyzing public security in Mexico from outside for years, the academics, the specialized journalists, the officials of other agencies who observe what happens in the country, described that result with a mixture of recognition and of something that is not exactly surprise, but that resembles it, as if they had been waiting to see if it was possible without being completely sure that it was, and then it turned out to be. That does not resolve all the questions there are about the Mexican security institutions, nor close, but it does contribute a new datum to that conversation, a datum that was not available before the 22nd of February. There is another dimension of this story that is rarely mentioned in journalistic coverages, but that international analysts pointed out quickly in the days after the operation. The relationship between Mexico and the United States in security matters is complex and has had significant tensions in recent years. Tensions related to the flow of arms, with collaboration in intelligence, with the way each country understands its sovereignty, and the limits of what it is willing to share with the other. Tensions that at some moments took cooperation to minimums that worried those who depended on it to do their work. The 22nd of February changed something in that conversation too. Not everything, not dramatically, but something. The United States agencies that had been offering rewards for information about the Mencho for years, that had built their own file on him with years of work, and that had had their own frustrations with a target that always seemed out of reach, received that result in a way that was visible in the way the official communications between both countries were given in the following days. Not with effusion, not with declarations that competed for the merit of the result, but with the type of quiet recognition that is given between institutions that have been working in the same direction for a long time, and that eventually see that something of that work arrived where it had to arrive. That recognition also matters because it forms part of the ecosystem within which these things occur, and because cooperation or its absence has concrete consequences that are measured in the operations that come after. Let us return once more to the question of what happens now with what remained of that organization, because it is the question that generates the most debate among those who follow it closely. Those who know these structures from inside, those who have worked years documenting how they work, point out something that the more superficial coverages frequently miss. The CJNG was not just an organization centered on one person. It was a network of relationships, of regional alliances, of agreements with other actors that were built over many years and that do not disappear automatically when the figure that sustained it is no longer there. What does happen, and what the analysts describe with relative consistency, is that those relationships enter a period of renegotiation. The alliances that were maintained by loyalty to a specific figure or by fear of that figure, or simply by the inertia of years of functioning, have to reconfigure in some way in its absence. And that reconfiguration process is, in terms of intelligence, a moment that can be taken advantage of in ways that were not possible before. The actors who move, who negotiate, who seek new positions, leave traces that static actors do not leave. The communications that are generated in periods of uncertainty are more numerous and frequently less careful than those generated when everything is stabilized and everyone knows their place. That is something that the intelligence teams that have been working on this for a long time understand very well, and it is one of the reasons why the 22nd of February does not mark the end of an effort, but the beginning of a different stage of the same effort, a stage that requires exactly the same type of method and patience that was needed to get there. Perhaps more, there is an element of this story that I have not yet mentioned directly, and that, nevertheless, was present in every moment of the 5 years that this account covers. The families. Not the families of those who were the target of the operations, the families of those who did the work, those who built the intelligence, those who coordinated the processes, those who made the difficult decisions, the people who were on the other side of those lives for 5 years, who saw someone arrive home with a weight that could not always be explained in words, who learned to read the silence in a way that no one should have to learn. That side of the story is never told. Not because it is not real, but because the people who lived it have no interest in telling it publicly, and because there are practical and security reasons for that discretion that go beyond personal preference. But it exists. It is part of the cost I mentioned before, the cost that does not appear in any communique nor in any intelligence analysis, the one that is measured in dinners to which someone arrived late or did not arrive, in conversations that remained half because the head was somewhere else, in the way that this type of work shapes people in ways that are not always visible until someone who knows them well points them out. That cost also deserves to be in the complete history of what happened. The last image I want to leave you of this story is small. It is not dramatic, but it captures something that I believe is more true than any official statement. At some point in the days that followed the operation, someone who knows García Harfuch saw him in a hallway before a meeting. An ordinary hallway, with the type of artificial light that all hallways of all government buildings have. He greeted him. They exchanged some words, the type of brief exchange that one has when both people have things to do and time is limited. And then Harfuch continued walking like that, without drama, without the solemn gravity that one would expect to find in someone who has just closed in some way the most personal chapter of his entire professional life. The person who tells this says that he stayed standing in that hallway for a moment after Harfuch disappeared around the corner, and that he thought about everything that man had carried since that Sunday of June of 2020. In the wounds, in the escorts, in the woman who was passing by there, in the 5 years of work that no one saw while it happened, in the difficult decisions that have no manual and that are taken anyway because someone has to take them. And he says something that is not a big thing as a phrase, but that as an observation is exact. He says, there are people who work for what corresponds to them, and there are people who work for something more than that. I do not always know how to call that difference, but when one sees it, one recognizes it and does not forget it. This story has a beginning that everyone could see in the news. A Sunday of June of 2020 has a development that very few saw while it happened, because it happened in places that have no coverage, and in times that do not fit in any news cycle. And it has a result that arrived in a place in Jalisco early in the morning of the 22nd of February of 2026, in a way that no one seemed completely possible until it was completely real what comes after that result, what happens with what remained of that organization, with the intelligence that was built and that is not exhausted with a single operation, with the communities that have been waiting for years for something to change in a tangible and lasting way in their life, that is still being written in real time with all the uncertainties that accompany everything that is not yet ended. The operation of the 22nd of February when they killed El Mencho has a layer that almost no one has told complete. It is in the video that you see on screen. Give it a click to know the complete story never before told. Yeah,